was August 11th, 2018. Jamie Corver was 52 years old. He stood in the staging area behind the grandstand at the Morgan County Fair in Jacksonville, Illinois, with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set tight. His New Holland T6 180, 14 months old, 340 hours on the clock, still smelling faintly of factory paint and hydraulic fluid, sat idling 20 feet away. The sled was already hooked. The announcer's voice carried across the fairgrounds, tinny and sharp through the PA system, calling his name. 800 people filled the bleachers. Most of them were neighbors. Some of them were family. All of them had heard about the bet. Jamie didn't look at the tractor. He looked past the fence line toward the parking lot, where Frank Tobias, 68 years old, retired from active farming but still keeping 40 acres in a salvage barn full of old iron, sat on the fender of a 1952 Farmall M. The tractor was red, rust-pitted in places. The engine had been rebuilt twice. The rear tires were mismatched. Frank had pulled it out of a collapsed shed in 2009, spent 2 winters and most of his pension making it run, and now he ran it in every parade, every show, every chance he got to prove that new equipment was a waste of money. The bet was $15,000, cash, winner take all. Frank had proposed it 3 weeks earlier at the co-op, loud enough for a dozen men to hear, and Jamie, tired of being called a fool for financing modern equipment, tired of the jokes about blue paint and computer screens, had said yes before he thought it through. Now the sled was hooked. The crowd was waiting. And Jamie knew, somewhere in the part of his mind that had been farming since he was 16, that he had made a mistake. He didn't know yet how big a mistake. That would take 6 years to understand. If you found value in stories like this, stories that weigh the cost of decisions over years, not minutes, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. This kind of storytelling takes time to build, and it's meant for people who understand that farming isn't spectacle, it's consequence. The flashy moments pass. What stays is what you live with when no one's watching. If that matters to you, I'll keep building these stories. Thank you. Early context. Jamie Corver had farmed 640 acres of corn and soybeans south of Jacksonville since 1991, when his father died and left him the ground, the debts, and a collection of equipment that should have been replaced a decade earlier. He spent the 90s catching up. He bought used, he repaired more than he replaced. He learned to live with downtime, with parts orders that took 2 weeks, with machines that didn't owe him anything, but didn't promise him anything either. By 2010, he was stable, not comfortable, stable. The farm paid for itself. His wife, Linda, worked part-time at the seed dealer to cover health insurance. Their son, Eric, was in college studying agricultural engineering and had no clear plans to come back. The operation was what it had always been. Enough. In 2017, Jamie traded in a 1998 tractor, a machine he'd run for 19 years, through 3 transmission rebuilds and 1 engine overhaul, for a New Holland T6 180. It was not an impulsive decision. He'd spent 2 years talking to his dealer, running the numbers, weighing the fuel efficiency improvements, the emission standards, the warranty coverage. The tractor cost $87,000 after trade-in. He financed it over 7 years at 4.2% interest. The New Holland was quieter than anything he'd ever operated. The cab was pressurized, climate-controlled, and equipped with an 8-inch display screen that monitored engine load, fuel consumption, and hydraulic pressure in real time. The transmission was a 16-speed power shuttle with electro-hydraulic shifting. It had 165 horsepower at the PTO and weighed 16,400 pounds fully ballasted. It was, by every measurable standard, a better tractor than what he'd been running. But it was also a symbol. In Morgan County, where a third of the farmers still ran equipment from the 1980s and early 1990s, where good enough was a badge of honor and debt was spoken about in whispers, buying new equipment made you visible. It made you a target for questions you couldn't answer in 30 seconds. Questions like, why do you need all that? What's wrong with what you had? You think you're better than the rest of us? Jamie didn't think he was better. He thought he was tired of losing days to breakdowns, tired of parts that didn't exist anymore, tired of burning fuel at rates that didn't make sense when corn was selling for $3.60 a bushel. But he couldn't explain that at the co-op. He couldn't explain it at church. And he especially couldn't explain it to Frank Tobias, who had decided, sometime in the early 2000s, after his own farm had been sold off piece by piece to pay medical bills, that old iron was the only honest iron, and that anyone buying new equipment was either a fool or a show-off. Frank's 1952 Farmall M had become his pulpit. He trailered it to every show, every parade, every tractor pull within 100 miles. He talked about it constantly. How he'd found it in a shed with a seized engine and a cracked block. How he'd machined new sleeves, rebuilt the carburetor, rewired the magneto, and brought it back from the dead with nothing but time and stubbornness. How it didn't have a computer, didn't need a dealer, didn't cost him anything but sweat. The Farmall M produced 36 horsepower at the drawbar when it was new in 1952. After Frank's rebuild, it might have made 38. It weighed 5,400 pounds. It had a 4-speed transmission, no cab, no power steering, and no safety features beyond a handbrake and a seat belt. Frank had bolted on himself. It was not a practical farming tractor in 2018, but it had become something else. A statement, a rebuke, a way for Frank to prove, over and over, that the old ways still worked if you were tough enough to stick with them. Jamie had ignored it for years, but in July 2018, at the co-op, Frank had crossed the line. Jamie had been picking up hydraulic fluid and a set of hitch pins when Frank walked in, saw the new Holland parked outside, and said, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear, "That's a nice lawn ornament you got there, Jamie. Does it actually pull anything, or do you just drive it around to feel important?" Jamie didn't respond. He paid for his parts and walked out. But Frank followed him into the parking lot. "I'm serious," Frank said. "You spent, what, 90,000 on that thing? I bet my old Farmall could outpull it in front of God and everybody. You want to prove I'm wrong? Put your money where your mouth is." Jamie stopped. He turned. "How much?" Frank grinned. 15,000. County fair. Weighted sled. We pull until someone quits or something breaks. Winner takes the cash." A small crowd had formed near the front of the store. Jamie could see them watching. He could feel the weight of the moment, the way it would sound later if he walked away. He thought about the new Holland, the electro-hydraulic hitch, the power shuttle transmission, the weight, the torque. He said yes. Turning point. The rules were simple. Each tractor would pull a weighted sled 50 feet. The sled started at 8,000 pounds and added weight as it moved forward, using a mechanical transfer system that shifted ballast toward the front of the sled as the tractor pulled. Whoever pulled the sled the farthest before losing traction or stalling won. If both tractors completed the full 50 feet, the one with the fastest time won. The Morgan County Fair had been hosting tractor pulls since 1974, but they were usually exhibitions. Old restorations, antique steamers, the occasional modified pulling tractor built specifically for competition. This was different. This was 2 working farmers, 2 tractors that lived in sheds and ran in fields, and $15,000 in cash sitting in an escrow account at the bank. The fair board tried to talk them out of it. Jamie's dealer called him twice, warning that a pulling competition could void certain warranty provisions if the transmission or drivetrain was damaged. Linda asked him quietly, over breakfast the morning of the fair, if he was sure this was worth it. Jamie wasn't sure, but he couldn't back out. Not after saying yes in front of a dozen men at the co-op. Not after Frank had spent 3 weeks telling anyone who'd listen that modern tractors were all show and no spine. The pull was scheduled for 6 p.m. on Saturday, the last day of the fair, right before the demolition derby. By 5:30 the grandstand was full. People stood along the fence line. Trucks parked in the grass behind the track. The local radio station sent a reporter. Someone set up a tripod and a video camera near the announcer's booth. Jamie backed the New Holland up to the sled. The hitch clicked into place. He set the transmission to 3rd gear, engine at 1800 RPM, and checked the weight distribution. The rear tires, 480 80R46 radials, filled with calcium chloride for ballast, bit into the dirt. The engine note was smooth, almost quiet, even under load. Frank's Farmall M was next. He backed it up manually, no power steering, using only the handbrake and throttle to position the drawbar. The hitch was a fixed pin. The tires were ancient bias ply, cracked along the sidewalls but still holding air. The engine clattered. You could hear every valve, every rod, every compression stroke. The crowd cheered. Not for the New Holland, for the Farmall. Jamie went first. He released the clutch smoothly, let the transmission take the load, and felt the rear tires dig in. The sled moved. 15 feet. 20. The weight transfer engaged. The sled got heavier. 30 feet. The engine RPMs dropped slightly. The tires started to slip. At 38 feet, the New Holland lost traction. The rear wheels spun. Jamie tried feathering the throttle, tried shifting down, but the electro-hydraulic clutch couldn't find grip. The sled stopped. 38 feet. The announcer called it. The crowd clapped politely. Frank climbed onto the Farmall M. He set the throttle wide open. The engine screamed. He dropped the clutch. The tractor lurched forward. The rear tires, narrow, tall, steel-lugged at the edges from years of parade work, grabbed the dirt like claws. The sled moved 10 feet, 20, 30, 40. At 42 feet, the Farmall's engine started to labor. The RPMs dropped, smoke poured from the exhaust stack. But Frank didn't lift. He kept the throttle pinned. The tractor clawed forward, 45 feet, 48. At 49 feet, the engine stalled. The Farmall stopped. But Frank had won. The crowd erupted. People stood. They cheered. They whistled. Frank climbed down from the tractor, waved to the stands, and walked over to Jamie with his hand out. Jamie shook it. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He drove the New Holland back to the staging area, loaded it onto his trailer, and went home. He didn't stay for the demolition derby. He didn't talk to anyone. He just left. Linda was waiting in the kitchen when he got back. She looked at him. "How bad?" 15,000, Jamie said, and everybody saw it. Long consequence arc. The loss followed him. Not in obvious ways. No one mocked him directly. No one called him a fool to his face. But at the co-op, conversations paused when he walked in. At church, people asked how the tractor was running with a tone that wasn't quite neutral. At the grain elevator, the scale operator mentioned, casually, that Frank Tobias had been in earlier that week, still talking about the pull. Jamie stopped going to town unless he had to. The New Holland, for its part, worked. It worked exactly as it was designed to work. Through the fall of 2018, it pulled a 6-bottom plow through 480 acres of corn stubble without missing a stroke. The fuel consumption averaged 4.2 gallons per hour under load, which was 30% better than the tractor it had replaced. The cab kept the dust out. The transmission shifted smoothly. The hydraulic system responded instantly. But none of that mattered, because everyone in Morgan County remembered the pull. And in their memory, the New Holland had lost to a tractor that was older than most of their children. Frank, meanwhile, became a minor celebrity. The video of the pull was uploaded to YouTube and got 14,000 views in the first month. Frank was invited to 3 more pulls that fall. He won 2 of them. He started a Facebook page called Real Iron Still Works and posted photos of the Farmall M at shows, at parades, at his barn with the hood open and the engine exposed, captioned with phrases like, "No computers needed," and "Built when men were men." Jamie tried to ignore it. He focused on the farm, on the work, on the numbers that mattered, yield per acre, cost per bushel, profit margin. But the numbers were harder to explain than a pulling competition. And no one wanted to talk about fuel efficiency when they could talk about how a 70-year-old tractor had embarrassed a modern machine in front of 800 people. Winter came. Jamie paid Frank the $15,000 in December after the beans were sold. Frank deposited the check and bought a restored 1947 Farmall H to add to his collection. Spring 2019 arrived cold and wet. The ground didn't dry out until late April. By the time Jamie could get into the fields, he was 2 weeks behind schedule. He worked 16-hour days, planting 640 acres of corn in 10 days, with the New Holland pulling a 12-row planter. The tractor never faltered. The engine ran smooth. The fuel tanks lasted longer than expected. The cab kept him comfortable, even when the temperature outside was 42 degrees and raining. Frank, that same spring, didn't plant anything. He wasn't farming anymore. But he did show up at the Memorial Day parade in Waverly with the Farmall M, freshly painted, pulling a hay wagon full of local 4-H kids. The parade route passed right by the co-op. Jamie was inside picking up starter fertilizer when he heard the tractor go by. He looked out the window and saw Frank waving to the crowd, smiling, the Farmall's engine popping and crackling as it idled down Main Street. Jamie didn't wave back. Summer brought drought. By mid-July, the corn was stressed. Jamie ran irrigation equipment on 80 acres near the creek, powered by the New Holland's PTO. The tractor ran 12 hours a day, 3 days a week, moving water through pivots and pumps. It burned fuel, but it saved the crop. The corn on those 80 acres yielded 178 bushels per acre. The rest of the farm averaged 142. Frank's Farmall M appeared at the county fair again that August, pulling a modified sled in an antique tractor exhibition. He didn't compete for money this time, just for show. The crowd loved it. Jamie didn't attend. Fall 2019 was smooth. Harvest came early. The New Holland pulled a grain cart through the fields without issue, working alongside a neighbor's combine. The transmission handled the weight. The tires didn't slip. By the end of October, all 640 acres were harvested. The grain was sold, and Jamie had cleared enough profit to make the year's loan payment on the tractor and still set aside money for the next season. It was, by every practical measure, a successful year. But Jamie still thought about the pull. He still heard Frank's voice at the co-op. He still saw the video in his mind. The Farmall clawing forward, the crowd cheering, the New Holland sitting silent at 38 feet. Winter 2020 was different. In January, Frank Tobias had a stroke. He survived, but his left side was weakened. He couldn't climb onto the Farmall anymore. The tractor sat in his barn, under a tarp through the spring. Jamie heard about it at the seed dealer in March. He didn't visit. He didn't call. He told himself it wasn't his business. But in April, Frank's son, who lived in Springfield and worked in insurance, put the Farmall M up for sale. The listing appeared on Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and 3 online tractor forums. Asking price $12,000. The description mentioned the engine rebuild, the parade history, the pulling competitions. It did not mention the stroke. The tractor sold in 2 weeks to a collector in Indiana. Jamie never saw it again. Spring 2020 was the wettest on record. The fields didn't dry out until May 15th. Jamie had a 2-week window to plant 640 acres. He ran the New Holland 20 hours a day, stopping only to refuel and check tire pressure. The tractor pulled the 12-row planter through mud that would have stopped lighter equipment. The weight, the power shuttle transmission, the 4-wheel drive, all of it mattered. He finished planting on May 28th. He was the 3rd farmer in the township to get his crop in the ground. Most others didn't finish until mid-June. That summer, the corn looked better than it had any right to. The late planting didn't matter as much as getting it done in a compressed window. By August, the stalks were tall, the ears were full, and the yield estimates were strong. Frank Tobias, meanwhile, was in physical therapy 3 times a week. He couldn't drive. He couldn't walk without a cane. The barn where he'd kept the Farmall M was rented out to a neighbor for equipment storage. Jamie saw him once, in September, at the pharmacy. Frank was waiting for a prescription. He looked smaller, thinner. His left hand shook slightly. Jamie nodded. Frank nodded back. Neither of them spoke. Fall 2020 brought a different problem. Parts. The New Holland's hydraulic pump started leaking in October, halfway through harvest. It wasn't catastrophic, but it needed to be fixed. Jamie called his dealer. The part was in stock. It cost $840. The dealer sent a service truck out the next morning. The pump was replaced in 4 hours. Jamie was back in the field by noon. He thought about what that would have been like with the old tractor he'd traded in. The pump on that machine had failed twice, once in 2004, once in 2011. Both times, the part had to be special ordered. Both times, he'd lost 3 days waiting. Both times, he'd done the work himself in the shed because the service call would have cost more than the part. The New Holland's warranty covered the labor. Jamie paid for the pump. He kept the receipt. Winter 2021 was quiet. Jamie ran the numbers. The New Holland had 1,420 hours on it. Fuel costs over 3 years, $18,300. Maintenance costs, $3,100, most of it covered by warranty. Downtime, 6 hours total, all of it planned. The tractor had cost $87,000. He'd paid down $28,000 of the principal. He owed $59,000. At current depreciation rates, the tractor was worth approximately $68,000 on trade-in. He wasn't losing money, but he wasn't winning any arguments either. Spring 2021 was dry. Planting went fast. Jamie finished in 9 days. The New Holland ran perfectly. No breakdowns, no delays, no drama. Frank Tobias died in June. Heart attack. He was 71. Jamie attended the funeral. It was held at the Methodist Church in Jacksonville. 50 people showed up. Frank's son gave a short eulogy. He mentioned the Farmall M. He mentioned the pull. He said his father had been proud of that tractor until the day he sold it, and that he'd talked about the competition at the county fair more than anything else in the last few years of his life. Jamie sat in the back. He didn't cry. He felt something, but he couldn't name it. After the service, Frank's son approached him in the parking lot. "My dad respected you," he said. "He thought you were a good farmer. He just didn't like what the equipment companies were doing to people." Jamie nodded. He didn't know what to say. "He spent $4,700 fixing that Farmall after the pull," Frank's son continued. "The transmission failed in October 2018. Then the engine seized in 2019. He rebuilt it again, but it cost him most of what he won. He never told anyone." Jamie stood there. The words didn't land right away. "He sold it because he couldn't afford to keep fixing it," Frank's son said. "But he never stopped talking about beating you. I think it was the last thing he really enjoyed." Jamie drove home. He didn't tell Linda what Frank's son had said. He didn't write it down. He just filed it away, in the part of his mind where he kept things that didn't have conclusions. Late revelation. By 2023, the New Holland T6.180 had 2,680 hours on it. Jamie had owned it for 6 years. In that time, total fuel costs $32,400, total maintenance costs $6,200, total downtime 14 hours, warranty claims covered $4,100 in parts and labor, resale value $58,000, estimated trade-in. The tractor had pulled a plow, a planter, a grain cart, a disc, a chisel, a sprayer, and an irrigation pump. It had worked in mud, dust, heat, and cold. It had started every morning. It had never left him stranded in a field. In August 2023, Jamie attended the Morgan County Fair for the first time since 2018. He didn't enter any competitions. He just walked around, looked at the livestock, bought a pork chop sandwich, and stood near the grandstand while the antique tractor pull ran. There were 12 entries. Most of them were from the 1940s and 1950s. Farmalls, John Deere's, Alice Chalmers, one Minneapolis Moline. They were beautiful machines, restored to better than factory condition, painted and polished, and trailered in from across 3 counties. Not one of them was used for farming. Jamie watched them pull the sled. He watched the crowd cheer. He listened to the announcer talk about horsepower and history and heritage. And he realized, standing there with his hands in his pockets, that none of it had anything to do with farming. Farming was what happened in May when the fields were too wet and you only had 2 weeks to plant. Farming was what happened in October when the hydraulic pump failed and you had 400 acres left to harvest. Farming was what happened every year in the quiet hours when no one was watching and nothing was guaranteed. The pull at the fair in 2018 had been a spectacle, a moment, a story people told. But it hadn't been farming. In November 2023, Jamie's son Eric came home for Thanksgiving. He'd been working for a precision agriculture company in Iowa for 2 years. Over dinner, he asked his father if he'd ever considered upgrading to a T7 series tractor with more advanced guidance systems. Jamie thought about it. "Maybe," he said, "in a few years." "You don't regret buying the T6?" Eric asked. Jamie looked at his son. "No." "Even after the fair? After Frank?" Jamie set his fork down. "Frank spent most of what he won fixing the tractor that beat me. Then he spent another 2 years fixing it again before he had to sell it. I spent 6 years running mine. Which one of us made the better choice?" Eric didn't answer. "That's the problem," Jamie said. "There's no good answer. Not one people want to hear." Ending. It's 2024 now. Jamie Corver is 58 years old. The New Holland T6-180 has 3,100 hours on it. It sits in the shed next to a grain cart and a disc harrow, waiting for spring. The Farmall M that Frank Tobias rebuilt and ran and bet $15,000 on is in Indiana now. owned by a man who takes it to shows on weekends and keeps it in a climate-controlled barn the rest of the time. It's worth more now than it was in 2018, but it doesn't farm. Jamie thinks about the pull sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. He thinks about the weight of the sled, the sound of the crowd, the way Frank's face looked when he climbed down from the Farmall and walked over to shake his hand. He thinks about the $15,000 and the $6,700 Frank spent fixing the tractor afterward, and the fact that in the end, neither of them really won. But the New Holland still starts. It still pulls, it still works, and that, Jamie has learned, is the only victory that lasts. He doesn't talk about it much. There's no need. The men at the co-op have moved on to other arguments. The fair has other stories. The video of the pull is still online, but no one watches it anymore. The work continues. The fields wait. The seasons turn. And the New Holland, quiet and steady and unspectacular, keeps running. That's what it was built for. That's what it does.